applicants at Columbia University. And in both those roles, I've analyzed and read a lot of resumes, and so I think it's an exciting topic. It can be kind of daunting, right? And there's a lot of information to cover and a lot of misconceptions that we kind of want to walk through, and some tactics in terms of building the best resume for each role that you're pursuing. And in fact, in this video, I want to break it into a couple different sections. We'll talk about maybe the purposes of resumes, some effective tactics and ways of phrasing and building your own resume, and then we'll go over some misconceptions and ideas and myths that are floating around about resumes so that you can put your best foot forward with every role that you're pursuing, right? So just to dive right into it, let's talk about kind of the purpose of resumes, right? Because it's 2020, right? Everyone's on LinkedIn, right? Everyone has their online profiles, GitHubs, things like that, right? So a lot of people are asking, why do I even need a resume? Especially when I have all these profiles and things online and such an online presence. You're right. There are a lot of great tools that are out there that are sort of supplements to your resume, like LinkedIn, like GitHub, like other portals where you may have, or portfolios where you may have examples of your work. But they aren't necessarily replacements of each other or replacements for your resume. You definitely need both tools and all the tools actually at your disposal to be effective in telling your story and really making your argument for a particular role. And that's where the resume comes in. It's about telling your story and crafting an effective argument for a particular role that you're pursuing. So again, different tools for different audiences. Remember, your LinkedIn profile is seen by anybody and everybody, right? Colleagues, people you want to keep in touch with, people in different industries, teammates, things like that. It's a great platform to tell your story very broadly, right, and share your interests. It can even get you noticed for roles and companies that you're interested in. But it's in that sense a little bit more open-ended, right? A resume is a very specific document for a very specific opening that you're pursuing, whether that's applying online or being referred to by a colleague or being reached out to by a recruiter, right? So I actually want to take a step back, right? Because if we're talking about the purpose of a resume, it helps to understand sort of what it speaks to, right? And why it needs to be sort of tailored and an effective targeted argument. When a hiring manager at a particular company has an opening on their team, they sit down with the recruiter who supports them, right? They refer to them, the recruiter refers to that hiring manager actually as their client, right? They support that manager. The two of them sit down and they draft what are called the minimum qualifications and the preferred qualifications for a particular role, right? You've probably heard these terms before. But they're very important, and a lot of them refer to them as MQs for minimum qualifications and PQs for preferred qualifications. So just kind of keep your ears open for that. But these are very important. These are the things that they have taken time out of their day, the manager and the recruiter, to sit down and say, these are the things that are, the must-haves for this role, that are very important for this role. And in fact, it dips into some legal territory too, where the minimum qualifications are kind of set in stone in that sense. They are the things that a candidate can legally sort of be rejected right off the bat for, right? If they don't meet these minimum qualifications. These are said, this is at a bare minimum, this is what we need to have to move forward, right, with that initial phone screen or coffee chat or something, right? And then the preferred qualifications are sort of the icing on the cake, they say, and it's even better if you have these things. But those minimum qualifications are super important. And your resume really needs to speak to those things for every single role that you're applying to, right? So you might ask yourself then, and this sort of leads into my next point, is, well, how many different copies and versions of my resume do I need? The answer is as many copies and versions of your resume as jobs and roles that you're pursuing, right? Given that each role has variations in its minimum requirements or preferred requirements, you need to submit resumes that are tailored to each and every single role that you're applying to, right? And we're going to talk about common misconceptions in a few minutes, right? But for right now, I do want to touch on, keep in mind that reputable companies and large companies don't rely on, people call them bots, right, or ATS, applicant tracking systems, right, to screen for resumes for keywords, right? Remember that there are real people that are sitting down and reading your resume along with 1,000 other resumes, right, for the same role, right? So we want to make sure that we're making yours in a way that stands out from all those other ones, okay? So someone sat down and thought real hard about those MQs and PQs, minimum qualifications and preferred qualifications, when posting that role, right? And that's what you see on the company's career page when you log in. They sat down and they decided this is what we need. Um, you can also think of it though in a way that they're giving you the answers to the test, right? They're saying this is what we're looking for in our applicant. And if you can create a resume that speaks directly to those, at least those minimum qualifications and even some of the preferred qualifications, right? Well, it's going to be a breath of fresh air to the recruiter, right? Or the screener or the hiring manager, whoever is looking at your resume, right? They're actually going to be thankful that you took the time to put together a thoughtful resume that shows that you at least read the job description and said, yes, look, and you crafted bullets that speak to each and every one of those points, right? It's going to help the recruiter, right, in forwarding it to the hiring manager and not asking them to read 3 pages of everything you've done in your entire career, right, and making them sift through all of that to look for the relevant experience. If you create a targeted, specific resume for them, you're making their job easier. They're going to be thankful, and it's going to make things easier for you as well as an applicant, right? So I know we touched very briefly on sort of the purpose of a resume, right? It's about creating a specific argument, very specific, sort of highlights of your story that speak to the very specific requirements for a particular role. Now I want to talk about some of the tactics, right, and some techniques in terms of actually building out that resume and how to make it stand out, right, to the reader. Think back to your, college writing days, and they say consider the reader, right? The same thing applies here. Um, I want to make yours stand out when being looked at by a screener or by a recruiter. So as a recruiter myself and someone who has crafted many versions of my own resume, I personally like to follow what's called the XYZ method of resume bullets. And it's an expression that was coined by Laszlo Bock. He's the CEO of Humu now, but he was also senior vice president of people operations at Google. If you have any doubts as to the effectiveness of this technique. But there'll be a separate document that dives deeper with some examples of how we can actually, phrase things according to the XYZ method, right? But the idea is that you've accomplished X relative to Y by doing Z, okay? Accomplished X relative to Y or for Y by doing Z. And the problem is that most resume writers and job seekers write boring resume bullets, right? Um, it's strange sort of just presenting your experience, and a lot of people just present what they did in a particular role or for a particular company, because isn't that the whole point of a resume? Yes, but there's effective ways of doing it. They talk about what they did in each bullet, but with no context or sort of indication that they maybe went above and beyond in doing that, right? If you can read a resume bullet, if you sit down and look at your resume and read one of your bullets just to yourself, and if you can ask yourself, so what? Right? Well, trust me, the recruiter or the hiring manager are going to be asking the same question. So what? Wrote X lines of code. So what? Right? Was that your job? Right? Did you go above, was that above, expectations for that particular role? What did you accomplish by writing that code? Was it part of a larger project? Right? So the idea with the XYZ method is that it actually leads with the so what. You accomplished X, right? And what you did, writing X amount of lines of code, right? We'll save that for the end, right? We know that's what you did because your job is a programmer. Okay, so we're going to lead off by what you actually accomplished. So what? The X, right? We call it the X factor. It gets kind of cheesy. Um, but the idea is that it takes the pressure off of the recruiter and the hiring manager, right, to guess the impact of your work, right? And it just makes a more interesting bullet to read, right? And they'll immediately be able to see your degree of fit with that particular role. Again, it comes back to that larger point that we started with of crafting an effective argument. That's what this whole, as to your fit for this role, that's what the whole purpose of the resume is, okay? And again, there'll be a separate doc with some examples of that XYZ method, sort of before and after, and how you can sort of rephrase things to sort of conform as much as possible, realistically possible, right, to this format where you can be leading with the so what, right, what you actually accomplished, who it was for, what team it was for, and then what you actually did to do all that, okay? But before we get to that, I do want to also touch on some sort of misconceptions that are floating around out there. A little bit of myth busting, right? A lot of people say, and I touched on this earlier, is that, oh, there's just, you just have to put in keywords that are listed from the job description so it gets past the robot or the applicant tracking system, right? There, for all I know, there may be some companies that rely on a program to sift through for keywords and things like that. I'm not personally aware of them, and I would actually be suspect of hiring teams or companies that rely on such a heavy handed, sort of an impersonal approach to looking at your application or your resume. Reputable companies, right? And even large companies. People would think that large companies have to rely on these bots because they get so many applicants. No, large companies actually have the resources and have the time and the care to have actual people, real people, reading each and every single resume that comes in. There are whole teams of people that are dedicated just to that. They're the screeners, right? But they're reading your resume. Right? So yes, you do want to incorporate some of the keywords and things like that, right? You still want to um, make sure that you're talking to those qualifications, but you can't sort of say, oh, it's just a robot that I have to get past, right? But if anything, that means you need to be more diligent in crafting a really effective resume and crafting a really effective argument with your bullets in order to get that screener or get that recruiter to understand, that real person, to understand why you are a fit for that particular role. Okay. And again, another sort of misconception that we touched on earlier is say, hey, I already have a LinkedIn profile. Everything they need is there, right? That may be true, right? Your LinkedIn profile really, it should be comprehensive of everything you've done, right? Because it's for a very wide audience. And so you're putting all your career stuff on your LinkedIn profile. And that's great. You should be doing that. But that abundance of information doesn't help you in applying to a very particular role, right? The recruiter, yes, their first stop may be your LinkedIn profile just to get sort of a flavor of your career trajectory and the works and projects that you've done, right? But they still need that very specific and tailored targeted resume for that particular role that that recruiter is supporting, right? To see your exact fit with that role. Otherwise, you're asking them, you're putting the onus on them, right? You're saying, hey, here's my whole LinkedIn profile with everything I've ever done in my career. You decide if I'm a fit for this very specific role, right? It just, even subconsciously, it rubs the recruiter or the hiring manager the wrong way, right? And it puts, like I said, the onus on them to sift through everything you've done to pull out the relevant experience. Whereas a targeted resume is really just that. It's targeted. Say, look, yes, I have this wealth of information on my LinkedIn profile. I know you're going to look at it, but here, these are my very specific qualifications for this particular role, right? And it just makes things easier for you, and it makes things easier for the hiring team. Okay. And then another sort of myth that's out there, right, and sort of a theme that we hear is that a lot of people say you should have a one-page resume. Maybe back in the day, right, before LinkedIn profiles, right, where people actually go to the company and go to the front desk, right, and say, here's a copy of my resume, right? The one pager, right, might have been very helpful, right, because again, they're sifting through all those papers. Nowadays, I don't hold anybody to the one page sort of rule. Your resume really should be as long as it needs to be to create the succinct, targeted argument as to why you're the best fit for that role, right? Okay, I'll take that back a little bit. Try to keep it under 3 or 4 pages at the most, right? You still, be mindful of the reader. But to be beholden to this sort of arbitrary, it has to be one page, is simply not true, especially if you've been in the industry for more than 5 years, right? If you shoehorn yourself into saying, I only have to keep it to one page, well, then you could be leaving out, right? Or forced to feel that you're forced to leave out a lot of relevant sort of targeted examples that you want to provide for that specific role, right? So don't feel, sort of arbitrarily beholden to this one pager sort of rule. Again, be mindful of it going beyond 2, 3, 4, 5, pages, right? But if it goes into 2 or 3 pages and you feel that that's the amount of space that you need to create your specific argument, go for it. And in another video, we can talk about how sort of the amount of white space, right, margins and font size and all that also affects the length of the resume itself. There are sort of the aesthetics of it, right, that make it easier, even just physically easier for the reader to read, right, and understand. But my point is that you shouldn't necessarily feel beholden to any arbitrary sort of lengths of your resume. It should be as long as it needs to be to make your specific argument for that specific role that you are pursuing. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And Take care.